who you can't see, but I think I can. I'm not sure you can all see Molly. Yeah, everyone can see Molly. Okay, good morning. Welcome to Kent Invicta Live's Mental Health and Wellbeing webinar. My name is Miranda Chapman. I'm the chair of Kent Invicta Chamber of Commerce. You may all know that there's been an amazing series of seminars from the Chamber. This is one of a number, so lots of the board directors are hosting them, and I hope that you're all finding them really useful. This morning's webinar has got a very specific focus, so you will have seen in the pre-marketing material that we're here to talk really about the the extraordinary circumstances that we all find ourselves in, and most importantly, how that is impacting on mental health. There certainly was a very big focus on mental health and wellbeing in the business world in the lead up to COVID-19. It wasn't perfect, but it was getting better in the business environment. And I think it's fair to say that now more so than ever, it's going to be something we are all going to have to manage and manage in our daily lives, and probably we don't know how to do that. The webinar has got very few rules. We are going to just show one quick screen just to remind everybody of the engagement for this webinar. So always keep your camera on if possible. It's nice to see faces. Keep your microphones on mute if you're not speaking, certainly when the presenters are speaking. And then you've got your chat function. We found that that works best. So if you've got questions that you want to ask, just get them in, and between Molly, myself and Neil, we can make sure that they're answered as much as we possibly can. If we don't manage to answer all the questions today, we will certainly make sure that that's possible after this webinar. And just a reminder that this session is being recorded, so you've all seen your Zoom warnings. Make sure you've not got anything in your backgrounds, and that could be sensitive to you. I've got a very special background this morning that I've done in honour of Stephanie and Duncan, who are our guest speakers. So my nice calming wellbeing zone. I'm going to introduce our two speakers now. So the first speaker today will be Stephanie Unthank. Stephanie is the director of Infinity Wellness Project, and I've just found out she's also a fitness coach as well. So that's if you want to get fit after this, you can go and find Stephanie. Stephanie is going to be guiding us through really how to manage your mental health as we go through COVID-19. And we all now know that there is a process that we're all going to go through. And then we also have Duncan Cochrane-Dyet from MHA, very large regional firm accountancy practice. And Duncan is also, I'm going to read this out because I want to get it right. Duncan is the head of healthcare for MHA. They're a top 15 accountancy practice, actually. And he's also the managing partner. And so Duncan is going to be looking at mental health provision and within the NHS setting, and how challenging that is, and how we might get back to a sense of normality again as we go through the stages. So at the end of the session, I will remind everybody of what we've also got coming up, and Molly will also be able to support on that as well. So I think without any further ado, we'll start off with Stephanie. So really big welcome to Stephanie Unthank, who is from Infinity Wellness Project.
Thanks so much, Miranda. Yeah, morning everybody. So as you can see on the first slide, I'm going to be talking today about dealing with uncertainty. But just before we get into that, yeah, my name's Steph Unthank. I'm based in Ashford in Kent. And predominantly, so I've been running my own business for about 4 years, and predominantly my work involves working with corporates, small, medium and large enterprises around wellness in the workplace. And that I major, I guess, in terms of my specialism is mind health, so mental health, mind health. But I also do still dabble a bit with physical fitness and nutrition as well, and I still work with one-to-one clients and with families. So if we could just move to the next slide. So we're looking at dealing with uncertainty, and I thought, it would be really good actually for us to just acknowledge that it's been a little bit rough out there for us, hasn't it? We've really had to change the way that we live, and I know that that is something that everybody is aware of now, and I think that we are maybe getting to the point where we're hearing over and over again the sentences, yeah, it's a strange world we live in, right? Things are really funny at this time, and, you know, we're getting used to adapting. But I think there is a moment that we should take to acknowledge that actually we are going through a huge amount of change. We're changing the way that we live, we're changing the way that we work. We are having to adapt to new ways of interacting, just like we are today. And all of us, I'm sure, at some stage, most days, are thinking about our families, our friends, our colleagues at work, and our social circles that, quite honestly, we often take for granted, but we are missing a huge amount at the moment. So every day for all of us, it's a real balancing act. But I think the positives here are that we are surviving. You know, we should take some time to give ourselves some credit for what we've achieved so far, and that whether it's working from home or whether it's homeschooling our children or trying to do both, which a lot of people are, and that is bringing a huge amount of stress, I'm sure, to day-to-day life. Whether it's looking after our elderly parents and having to, you know, go and do the grocery shopping for them, and then trying to keep them company by sitting 2 meters apart in their front gardens, or even if it's just adapting to trying to run a business online and using Zoom for the first time, which can be really daunting. You know, adapting this quickly and surviving in really, really unusual circumstances, we should acknowledge helps to build resilience. And later in life, it's this resilience that we have built that is really going to come into extremely handy moments, I think, for, you know, when we face into other life challenges. So we're moving on just to talk a bit about acceptance now. And it's inevitable, I think, that in this period of time and in this period of uncertainty, we are going to be faced into heightened stress and heightened anxiety. And that will affect many of us, if not most of us. In certainly the statistics around those suffering with stress before COVID-19 was around 2 in 5, and that was for people that were admitting it. But we expect those numbers to go up to 4 in 5. 4 in 5 will suffer from stress or anxiety through COVID-19, or at least when we come out the back of it. So accepting the fact that we are here for the long haul, and actually we are going to suffer from some type of stress or anxiety, is a really good place to start, and working with that rather than pushing against it. So it can be helpful, I think, that when you speak to your family and your friends and your work colleagues, it can be really useful to sense into their tone, sense into their mood. How are they feeling? What are they talking about? What are the topics of discussion? Because often we think that we are alone in these journeys. We are alone in dealing with stress. We are alone in suffering from anxiety. But in fact, even though we feel we're alone, more often than not, we're not. And most other people around us are suffering in a similar or the same way. So that sense of common humanity can really help us to move forward and help us to feel supported. And then looking at thoughts are not facts. So just take a moment to think about those words. Our thoughts are not factual. And indeed, we are not our thoughts. So when we feel worried or anxious, we can often get caught up in storytelling. And we find ourselves getting caught up in this kind of game of what if, worst case scenarios. So this kind of ongoing cycle of stories that we get pulled into. And of course, you know, we will be having discussions with other people on the phone and on Zoom, where we're thinking about trying to plan in some way, shape or form for the future. Or we might even be talking about, you know, what if this doesn't change? What if things don't improve? And that's really normal behaviour. It's normal human instinct. It's part of our fight and flight mechanism that kicks in. And overall, really bringing ourselves to notice that these thoughts are rising, and kind of remembering this sentence that our thoughts aren't factual, and therefore we're not our thoughts, can really help us to stop us from going down into a spiral of suffering. So it can be useful just to bring our attention to any storytelling or ruminating that might be going on in our minds. So it's really wise just to see how we can get caught up in our own heads, and how that can cause us a bit more suffering, which can be unnecessary at times. And also I think to remember that as human beings, we spend about 95% of our time living in our heads. So allowing ourselves to make up these stories and ruminate in this way is unuseful. It's not very useful, as I said. So really kind of bringing our attention to that and noticing when that's happening, pulling ourselves out of our heads and then back into our bodies can be a good way of dealing with that. So let me just help you with a few things that we can do. So what is your stability rocks? So we're on a slide now, Molly, with several pictures on. We've got what's your stability rocks. So Stability Rocks, I'm not talking about a band called Stability Rocks, I'm talking about the things that we can do in our day that help to bring stability. So what are the rocks in our day? The things that never budge. They're not pebbles and they're not sand, they are rocks. So some of these things can be really simple and we shouldn't take them for granted. So particularly if we are spending a lot of time working from home, getting up in the morning on our working week at the same time and having some stability and routine around that can really help to reduce suffering. Having lunch at a set time and taking a lunch break. Now, even at work, when we were at work face-to-face with clients or face-to-face with colleagues, we probably didn't do that. But that can be something that can be really useful now. Going through that routine of making lunch and eating lunch and taking a break can be really useful. Maybe reading a book when you take your break at some point during the day. So take yourself away from the screen, away from your work, away from the phone, and do something different, read a book or a magazine. Go running or go walking somewhere and do that as a rock, have that every day. Listen to music whilst you're working maybe, or even for leisure. Being in the garden, which loads of people have been talking about recently, there are so many benefits from being outdoors. Maybe playing with the children. But stability rocks, having these rocks in our day-to-day, the reason I talk about this is they're very good for grounding, okay, grounding ourselves. And grounding is really a tool that we can use where we have stability in our day that helps to bring a sense of centered calmness and control. Okay, so having these things that we know we're going to do each day can really help us to feel supported, centered, calm, and in control. So really think about what your own rituals are, what your own routine, you know, your own rituals, things that you can do every day that won't be disrupted and really can help to reduce that level of anxiety or stress that might be rising in your body and your mind. But let's take a look now at dealing with uncertainty and how we can tolerate it. Who'd have thought it? We could tolerate uncertainty. Learning to tolerate uncertainty for the long term and practicing to do that is actually possible. There's some techniques that we can do that you might just actually disregard because they're quite simple, but they really work. They really help to exercise the parts of the brain that can help us to prepare for uncertainty in uncertain times. So we can continue through this journey of uncertainty right now by doing a few things in order to be ready for more uncertainty as it unfolds. So something like choosing a book to read without researching it. So not even asking a friend, what do you think of this book? You know, not looking at the Google researches, not looking at what Amazon says about it, but just choosing it, maybe going by the front cover and thinking, I'm going to read that. And seeing what happens as an outcome. Maybe choosing a Netflix box set. Again, don't ask your friends, don't look at the research, don't look at the star rating, just watch it, pick it and watch it. Maybe cooking a meal that you don't have a recipe for, or if you need a recipe, only looking at it once, putting it away and then seeing if you can cook that meal from scratch without coming back to the recipe. If we maybe do more without planning, that's the message here, and not knowing the outcome, we will be better prepared to know how it feels to be in less control, in, you know, lacking in control in certain situations, and become more familiar of what it feels like in our bodies and in our minds, which is the particular lesson to learn here when things are a bit uncertain. So as I said, they might feel really simple, these things, but they can really unlock the part of the brain that helps us to deal with uncertainty and that continued unraveling of uncertain times. So maybe have a think about that. But if you are going to try some of these things, let's have a look at some of the things that you could ask yourself. So let's say I pick up a book and I begin to read it. It's got 20 chapters and I'm 5 chapters in. These are some of the questions on the next slide that actually talk about the things you should ask yourself. Did the book so far turn out okay? Because we weren't sure, were we? If things didn't turn out okay, then what happened? What did I do to cope with the negative outcome? So, well, I read 5 chapters out of 20. It's a bit boring. How did I deal with that? Was I able to handle the negative outcome? Or actually, did I dive into this kind of pit of despair and what a waste of time that's been? And then what does this tell me about my ability to cope with negative outcomes in the future? And that's the really important part. And my suggestion would be, if you're going to try one of these techniques, that you take your time to put something in your diary that says, okay, I'm watching this Netflix box set. There's 10 episodes. On episode 3, I'm going to answer these questions and I'm going to journal it. Then I'm going to put that journal to one side. I'll come back again at episode 6. I'll do it again. And then I'll come back again at episode 10 when it finishes and I'll see where I ended up. So just going through these motions, making a point of journaling the outcomes, and then just really sitting with how that's felt can be really useful in terms of nurturing those connections within our brain that can help us to deal with uncertainty. So what are the takeaways from today? The first thing is, let's give ourselves a little bit of kindness and credit and place that into our personal self-compassion bank. We are doing well, okay? We are building resilience for the long term. Acceptance is key. To reduce our stress and reduce our anxiety and to support ourselves, we need to accept that we're in this for the long term and that there will be this pathway of uncertainty. Our thoughts are not our facts, and therefore we are not our thoughts. We are a human body with muscle, with tissue, with bones, with structure, and we shouldn't be thinking about spending 95% in our heads. Let's think about what we can do to bring ourselves out of our thoughts. Our stability rocks can really help. So during our day-to-day life, these can really help to support us in achieving some equilibrium, which is about balance. Nothing too negative, nothing too positive, just sitting somewhere in the middle. And we can, if we want to, learn to tolerate uncertainty by taking small steps. So I'm going to finish today with a short story. And this story is called The Farmer and His Horse, sometimes known as The Farmer and His Sage. It's a Chinese proverb and it goes something like this. A farmer and his son had a beloved stallion who helped the family earn a living. One day, the horse ran away and their neighbours all exclaimed, "Oh no, your horse has run away, what terrible luck that is." And the farmer replied, "Maybe so or maybe not. We'll see." A few days later, the horse returned home and it was leading a few other horses back with him as well. The neighbours, they all shouted, "Your horse has returned and it's brought several horses back with him. What tremendous great luck that is." And the farmer replied, "Maybe so, maybe not. We'll see." Later that week, the farmer's son was trying to break in one of the new horses and the horse threw the farmer's son to the ground, breaking his leg. And all the villagers cried, "Oh no, your son has broken his leg. What terrible luck that is." And guess what the farmer replied? "Maybe so, maybe not. We'll see." A few weeks later, soldiers from the National Army marched through the town, recruiting all the able-bodied boys. But of course, they couldn't take the farmer's son. He was still suffering from his broken leg. All of the friends and the villagers and the neighbours, they all got together and they shouted, "Your boy is spared. What tremendous luck that is." And the farmer replied, "Maybe so, maybe not. We'll see." And of course, the moral of the story is that no event in or of itself can truly be judged as good, bad, lucky or unlucky, fortunate or unfortunate, but only time will tell the whole story. So really waiting and being patient and trusting the process that we're going through and allowing our story as human beings to unfold can be really useful. Maybe so, maybe not. We'll see. Thank you.
Steph, thank you very much. Thank you. That was absolutely brilliant, Steph.
Thank you.
I'm not even going to try and praise that amazing presentation from Steph, but I have made a few notes and I hope these are going to be helpful before we kick off the Q&A. We'll do Q&A at the end of each session, by the way. So it's the fact that change brings uncertainty, but I think what Steph is telling us and encouraging us to think about is that we can deal with that uncertainty. We have to break that uncertainty down into little chunks, and we have to have mechanisms to manage what we are all going to face across the next couple of weeks and months. And just to kick off the conversation and put a bit of flavour to what Steph has shared with us today, I was going to do this at the beginning of the session, but I looked at what Steph was going to tell us, and I thought this is a better point to bring this in. So here's some more change and uncertainty for you. The Times today has published an article around the new, well, we all know about FOMO, fear of missing out. So the new one is FOGO, which is fear of going out. So I urge you all to go and have a look at the Times online today. And just as Steph was talking, it really sort of brought it into focus. You know, there's all these things that are being chucked at us on a daily basis around uncertainty and change. And there's another one. You know, I'm sure some of those tips that Steph has just given us about our stability rocks might help with FOGO. I don't know what you think, Steph.
Yes, I do. Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that we need to be, and I know that we might have time for a Q&A at the end, so I won't take too long, but I think we
We'll
need
do
to,
one now, Steph, actually. Do a quick one
okay,
now.
yeah, I think we need to be really aware, ladies and gentlemen, Miranda, that actually, as we go forward, you know, the way that we are thinking, feeling and behaving is going to change. And there will be the challenge around where we've got used to this new world, that actually going back to any, let's say, old world, how we used to know it, which I don't think it'll ever be the same, but going back to our old way of being may become difficult. And I think that the thing that I would say is this kind of FOGO, this fear of going out, is that the main thing for me is to just acknowledge, and I think it's about acceptance, right? So firstly, if we're suffering from it ourselves, we need to accept that that is something that we're going through, but the acknowledgement of how we will all be very different, and we really will. So some of us will cope with this really well, and we will live in the moment and be in the moment day to day, and will deal with anything that comes up and confronts us. Other people will be more challenged with this rumination and storytelling that will go on, and that will be their challenge. But the main thing is, as individuals, that we understand everybody has a story. You know, there's 10,000 reasons. I always say this: there are 10,000 reasons why we're all different, and nobody will ever know what's another person's 10,000 reasons. It doesn't matter how well I think that I might know somebody, I'll never know their 10,000 reasons for being the person that they are. So I think really acknowledging that and knowing that we're all individuals and we'll get through this in our own way, it can be useful, and it can help us to be patient with others and trust the process and allow it to unfold. But then equally, the last thing I would say is that we must reach out. We must reach out. We must ask for help. We must support one another, but you know, don't necessarily allow us to even start to believe that short phone call of 30 seconds to ask a friend or a member of your family is okay, isn't needed anymore, because it really is. And I think we must reach out to one another, and we must ask for help when we need it.
Okay, so talking about reaching out, we've had a couple of questions that have come in behind the scenes. So the first one then is stability better than routine? Is that recommended, one over the other?
I think they're probably both the same to some degree. I suppose the thing around routine is that if we create routine, and let's say we're in an environment where we are working from home the whole time, we need to bear in mind that being encapsulated in this, what we would deem as a safe bubble, we'll start, 2 or 3 things can happen. It's either monotony, or it's slipping into habits, or it can end up being this FOGO, as we're talking about today, this fear of going out. So the routine part of doing things at different times each day, I think, can help to bring normality, let's call it normality of some sort. And then when we going back into the new norm, going into that new normal, maybe that transition will be slightly easier. The stability piece, I think you could see in a slightly different way, in that I suppose the edge might be that the stability stuff might be the things that we do that help us to feel good. So you could maybe swap out the word stability and call it a sustainer. So what are the things that we could do each day to help us feel sustained? You know, so just briefly on that, Miranda, I would say get a piece of paper, write the word sustained on one side, write the word drained on the other, make a list of 10 things that we know that when we do them in our lives, they make us feel really good and really joyful, and they bring pleasure to our lives and our heart and soul, reduce our stress and our anxiety, and then make a list of the 10 things that make us feel a bit naff. And then see if you can do more of the good and less of the drainers. So more of the sustainers, less of the drainers, and try and work out why you're doing the drainers and how they make you feel. Because actually, if we're doing them because we think we should, then try and let some of that stuff go. I know that it's not completely possible to let all of it go all the time, but we need to just counteract that and do more of the good stuff to boost our well-being, boost our brain health, boost our body health, give us that boost of self-esteem and confidence, so that when things do start to change, we're in a good place and we can go forward with courage.
Steph, that's really great. So we can all take away sustain versus drain. That's another really practical tip from Steph. We've got time for another question, but I'm just going to give a little bit of feedback as well before we bring Duncan on. So one of our viewers is saying thank you to you, Steph, and you're getting some really good feedback. They're saying that they do use Stability Rocks a little, but they're going to do more so now. So that's another positive from today's session. I've got another question that's come in, so related really to everything that you've been saying. So how do we get this good work-life balance in the new environment, so in this changing environment, especially if we're struggling to switch off from work? I mean, we're We're in our homes at the moment largely. We are going to go back into some type of work setting at some point. So I guess there's two types of balance, isn't there? There's the balance now, and then the balance as we start to switch back to whatever that new normal is.
Yeah, so I think that's come up a lot in the last 8 weeks of my work in corporate, particularly in the corporate environment. Working from home, we can slip into some really bad habits. So whether that's kind of getting up early and starting early and then finishing late, or actually getting up later and then finishing really late, like early hours of the morning, not useful. So that's just one example. The thing really is to, when I talked about stability rocks, and I think this will help in context of the question, I've always said that there's no real difference between work and life, because work is life. So it's life, not work life. So hopefully that makes sense, right? So instead of seeing work as work and life balance, we look at it as a life balance. So if, for instance, I did sustainers and drainers, and in my drainers, one of my things I wrote as a sentence was, my hours are too long, I need to look at my life balance because I need to work, right? So I think there's something in that. But then when I talked about stability rocks, this can really help, this imagery. So if a rock is something that doesn't shift because of the weight of it, that will be something that never changes. But then we can have pebbles, which you can move, and then you can have sand, which is very fluid. So 3 types of rock, let's say. So a stability rock for work-life balance, if that's what you want to call it, I'll call it life balance. A stability rock will be that I always start work at 9 o'clock in the morning. I always have my lunch at 1 o'clock. I have 2 breaks, 10 minutes, one at 11 o'clock and one at 3, where I normally have a snack. And I finish work without a doubt between 5 and 5:30. And I give myself that little bit of leeway just in case I need to run over, because that does happen. Now that would be a rock. There's a rock there, rock at 9, rock at 1, rock at 5 to 5:30. But then there would be pebbles all around, and there'd be pebbles that I could shift. So there might be, that meeting could be shifted, so I could do that tomorrow, and that would mean that I wouldn't be working until 7 o'clock. Or that meeting doesn't need to be at 8 o'clock. I need to be really firm and use my courage with that individual and say, I'm not having that conversation at 8 because my working day starts at 9. And actually my wellness and my own self-care is really important to me. And we should take the courage to have those conversations. And then I think the sand is the stuff that really doesn't matter. It's like, don't sweat the small stuff, just let it go, right? The sand can be pushed around all over the place. So I think sometimes having this bit of a list of things that I must do, things that could move, things that don't really matter for life balance can be really useful. But the rock stuff around, I'm going to start my day at 9, I'm going to finish it between 5 and 5:30, give ourselves that little bit of leeway because we need to accept that sometimes happens. Really putting those rocks down firm, unmovable, can be really useful. So I think that would be where I would start.
Thank you. Stephanie, thank you very much.
Thanks.
I really would love for everybody listening to perhaps let Neil and Molly at the Chamber know after this webinar what your rocks are, you know, even if in the coming days and weeks you look at your rocks and feed back to the guys, because you know there will be other occasions where we can bring this webinar back and we can take it on a step further. I always say this, sometimes when you listen to people like Stephanie, you think some of that's so obvious, but you need people to come and have these conversations with us and just strip it down a bit and create some clarity. So I love the analogy you've just made about the rocks, the pebbles and the sand.
Lovely.
Makes no sense to me. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for the opportunity. Lovely.
Very welcome. We're going to welcome next Duncan. So we're making good progress on time. So we've got lots of time. That's really great. I mentioned before that Duncan is the National Head of Healthcare for MHA. You will have seen on his preamble, on the marketing preamble, that his wife is also a GP and his family are currently working on the front line. So I think that Duncan is very suitably qualified to be talking to us today. His particular title of his presentation is Management, Leadership and Communication. He's going to be touching on topics such as NHS support, the current trends that the NHS are seeing, and COVID-specific matters along the way as well. So without further ado, we'll do the same with Duncan. We'll get Duncan's presentation. Questions along the way, please, guys, on the chat, so that I can pose to Duncan at the end, and then we'll have Q&A with Duncan, and then we'll do a little wrap up with everything towards the very end of the session. So take it away, Duncan.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much, Miranda, and really excellent presentation and talk from Steph there. And I'm certainly going to go off and think about what my stability rocks are after this. I think that's an excellent way of putting it and giving us something to think around. Yeah, I need healthcare for MHA on a national basis. In Kent, we deal with, especially primary care, we deal with some 60% odd of primary care providers, GPs and the like. What I wanted to really talk about today is what structures the NHS has got and how this is all being affected by COVID and what we can expect to see coming down the line, because that's our best lead on how to access mental health services. But I think it's all useful for us all to really understand what the challenge is and what is being done behind the scenes, because obviously we get all the COVID headlines and a little sense of what lies behind that is quite useful. Can I go on to the next slide, please? This is just to give a bit of context. I mean, the healthcare sector is hugely complicated. It's structurally very complicated. There's a lot of organisations, and there's a lot of money involved as well. And mental health is all part of that and very much reflects that complexity. So I won't go through the whole of the environment, but I just wanted to set that as a pointer. So if we could go to the next slide. This is best illustrated within the UK, looking at where the money is spent on healthcare. So this is spending going back to 1718, but it's very reflective of the current position. So hopefully that graph kind of explains itself. But if I go from the bottom left up to the top, alcohol and drug speaks for itself, 147 million, so not inconsiderable. The next bubble is IAPT, and that's improved access to psychological therapies. So that's really primary care level, that's GP referral to talking therapies or own self-referral through some of the websites and other mechanisms to talking therapies, cognitive behaviour therapies and so forth. Mental health specialists is again self-explanatory. CAMS, that's Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. And I know that within the press and everything, I think we're all aware that this is one of the areas of focus where it's felt that there's plenty more that could be done within that area. But it's worth looking at that number and saying £750 million currently is being spent on it. And to significantly improve that area, to put significant resource behind it, would require an awful lot of more money. Secure services can surprise some people in how large this is within the mental health budget. And secure services is those secure units where patients are detained under a section of the Mental Health Act. So when you hear about someone being sectioned, they're usually sectioned to a secure unit. Acute units primarily, where unfortunately very unwell people are looked after. Also includes forensic units where a crime may have been committed. And so patients are kept forensically segregated whilst an investigation takes place. But that's a figure that's heading up towards £1 billion. And then the largest area of spend is within the care clusters. The care clusters are basically operating at a more local level. And that's where you've got a multidisciplinary approach to access and patient care. And this is teams such as NHS teams, obviously, mental health workers, psychiatrist services, social workers and support workers, working alongside the voluntary and community sector. So a lot of different organisations involved in there. And if we flip onto the next slide, we drill into that a little bit to see again where the money is being spent within the care cluster. And hopefully people can read that. It's a little small, certainly on my screen. But that breaks down the areas of where the main spend is, and that sort of correlates most closely towards the sorts of of mental health problems that are being tackled within that approach. One area to look at is it's a cognitive impairment bit. That's a third from the left, 630 million being spent there. And similarly to the what we looked at in terms of the youth services and the young people services, this is where dementia care is part of all this spend. I think, again, another area where in the press it's certainly reported there's a feeling that with dementia increasing as an issue, that increased spend in this area is probably necessary. But we again are looking at a pretty significant budget for that alone. And into the middle of all this lot, we then throw COVID-19. So if I could go to the next slide, please. So this slide explains the NHS's three-phase response to COVID. And phase one is the emergency response. On 30th of January, a level 4 national incident declared, the fastest and most far-reaching repurposing of NHS services, staffing and capacity in the 72-year history. What this means is that there's been a huge shift in resource away from all aspects of care, including mental health care, so that what's left is dealing with urgent care only, so that those resources, both in terms of people, but money and facilities, are directed towards the COVID response. And then phase two, which started at the beginning of May, is what we do now, because we're coming down the curve in terms of infection rates and death rates. The country is still at a level 4 national incident level. And so the COVID-19 response still remains the main thrust of what's going on at the moment, but a gradual introduction of the other services as well, to make sure that, that people who need it are being picked up and those other services are re-establishing themselves properly. Phase 3 is the recovery phase, and you can say return to normal, but it's return to a slightly new normal. Anticipation within that there will be some changes in behaviour, and there will be some changes in demand on the mental health services as a result of the pandemic. The NHS leadership has released advice to local care providers. So if you flip onto the next slide, in terms of what that advice is in terms of our mental care providers, these are the priority actions. So establishing all age open access crisis services and helplines and promoting them locally alongside partners such as local authorities, KCC, for example, involved in this. For existing patients already known to the mental health services, continuing to ensure that they're contacted proactively, that they continue to get their support. And that'll be particularly important for people who've been discharged recently from inpatient services, and for those who are in the shielding programme. Children and young people, and the difficulty, if you will, within this section is access to referral points. And schools have been such an important part of the control of identifying young people who do have mental health problems, and giving them advice and pointing them in the right direction, and acting as a point of access into mental health services. And obviously with schools still closed at the moment, that doesn't exist in quite the same way. So action required in terms of that. Preparation for a longer term increase in demand. And Steph talked about this, about the inevitable consequences, both for people like us who are involved in the shutdown, but if you think about the NHS staff who are involved in delivering, especially on the frontline services and some of the distressing situations they find themselves in, there'll be a consequence, and there will need to be resources and services available for all those people. We mustn't forget about those with learning disabilities. So annual health checks really is about people with learning disabilities to ensure that they're not ignored within all this activity that's aimed at all sorts of various areas, and they're still very much involved in the system. Action to take to address inequalities and access. This is both in terms of economic inequality, deprived areas people in deprived areas do seem to find it harder to access mental health support, but also on racial lines. We know that the AME community is particularly impacted by COVID-19, and obviously investigation now has been started to try to explore that and understand more. So if I could go on to the next slide, please. I'll give you a chance just to read that script. The likely impacts of a pandemic on public mental health have been identified in research into pandemic flu as including increased levels of PTSD and other trauma symptoms, anxiety and depression. So I think that instinctively we all know that this is likely to be a problem for a large number of people. And I personally believe that all of us are feeling a level of distress in different areas and at different sort of intensities, if you will. But it's also recognised as an issue within the academic research. And if you are interested in this area, do follow that link through, and it's an interesting paper to read. What is happening in terms of local response to that is again within that our care cluster, and thinking about the way that the NHS services are working alongside voluntary and community level services and organisations. And one feature of that is this in itself is a complex arrangement. And whilst it works very well, and it does work very well in Kent, that is variable around the UK. And some of the issues around that, because you have different organisations involved, actually these organisations have got contracts between them. And there's money flowing as a result of those contracts. And for, say, voluntary sector organisations who are contracted with the NHS, for example, may be now required to provide services that aren't held within the contract. And therefore there needs to be some understanding about how the money can be released to service that, but it's not a contracted arrangement. And thus far, all these things have been very much cast in stone. So there's a little bit of release around that might be necessary. So that's areas that have been looked at the moment to consider how to ease those constraints a little bit to make it more efficient. So my last slide is really just picking up a number of the access routes into mental health. Obviously, the best access is through your GP and through the primary care framework, and GP is the first person to go to and share concerns. There are other access points, and this is by no means a full and complete listing. This is just a random selection of good access points, depending on where you are and what the issues are. What I would point you towards is the very first one, which is the Nhs Apps Library. Not a lot of people know about it, but if you go onto that, there's a mixture of paid and unpaid apps, and a lot of those are really, really good. So well worth getting onto that. And I think I know a lot of people here are you know, obviously you've got colleagues within your companies and so forth, and that's quite a nice way to spread the help, as it were. So that concludes what I was talking about in terms of the structural sides in response to COVID, and happy to take any queries you might have.
Duncan, thank you very much. I think that presentation just goes to remind us all how very complex the NHS structure is, and also just how much money is going into it. When you looked at your sort of linear line, there's some shocking amounts of money there, and that links to probably one of the first questions that has come in, actually, quite a broad question. So do you think the NHS will be able to work more creatively post COVID-19, whatever post COVID-19 looks like, of course?
There's a lot of discussion about routes into care. The difficulty of creativity, especially within the health industry, is that it usually requires investment. And the investment usually has to be measurable in terms of the benefit it provides. So creativity, I think we're really talking about one of the main areas is the use of technology and how that might work. We're aware that in other areas. For example, if you want financial advice and your own, your pension and so forth, you can go onto a website and you can access a bot, and some of the advice you get is actually pretty good. It's effective and it's right and it's correct. It operates on fairly limited lines. But there's a notion that there's areas like that that can be invested in, and gives people easier access. I mean, the fact today we're all in front of our computer screens and everything's digitalized and everything's available in that way. We access each other in webinars like this through our laptops and our iPads and so forth. And that has to be a way that the access to those services can be made easier. Because to some extent, it's like navigating a little bit of a maze to end up in the right point. Mental health is very, very complicated, and because of all the organisations involved, access to the bit that's going to really help you can be quite difficult. And advice from GPs and so forth like that is essential, but having some sort of a virtual access straight in is probably the best route.
Yeah, and I think that's whilst we're not here to give medical advice today, I think your presentation very ably shows how with services like CAMS. I think we're all aware how very difficult it is to access service like CAMS. So over the coming weeks and months, your mention of those NHS apps, I think, is very useful, and the list of sort of details you gave us at the end there on your last slide. We're probably going to have to help ourselves a little bit, aren't we, over the coming months. So we listen to talks like this today. We listen to Stephanie, we listen to yourself. We go and try and get as much remote content as we possibly can to take us through certainly until probably the end of the year, I would say. Would you agree?
Oh, I think so, certainly, and really. Getting the NHS back to normal, as it were, is probably a task that's measured in years now. Yeah. And I think, as I said in there, there's a normal and there's a new normal, and it will be a case of a new normal. In the same way that I know that James are going to talk about changes in the working environment and so forth in a later presentation. That's the same for healthcare as well. So to some extent, there is to the extent there is a benefit from what's happened. It does force mental health and other health providers to making available the digital access to their services. And previously, that was a fairly slow-moving vehicle, and now obviously it's snowballed, and people have been rather forced into it and finding actually it is possible, it does work, and now they need to understand how to manage the clinical advice, risk management and other aspects of that.
There's another question that's come in from Ellie, which both Duncan and Steph might want to just consider. So I think Ellie makes the broad point that her son is busy saving another part of our society, which is our economy. And actually her question is so valid. We're all talking about mental health. It's fairly a nebulous thing, mental health, and at the end of the day we've all got to go to work to earn money to live, to look after our mental health. It's a little bit of a challenging thing, really. So both Steph and Duncan, let's reality check all of this. How do we actually get that balance between having to do what we've got to do? We're all part of society. At the very beginning of your presentation, actually, Duncan, you reminded me that our society is us. We all make up society, and without great mental health, whether that's what we're doing ourselves or whether it's how the NHS and our GPs are helping us, we've got to be healthy and well to be part of that continuous circle. So can we just address Ellie's question and make it be broad? It doesn't have to be specific.
Sure. Well, I mean, I suppose, being a firm of accountants, that money and what our clients are up to is a big part of what we talk about every day. And we're part of the international network. And so the international messages are all very consistent. And we have to get everyone back to work. We need the money to be generated to support the public sector services that we rely on. And that's not an easy one. And certainly within my own organisation, we spend a lot of time agonising over it, and we haven't really got the answers yet. We've obviously had the initial guidance on Monday, which was arguably as good as it possibly could be at this stage, whatever your politics, about how we can get back to work. But it's going to be slow, isn't it? And I think we have to work around people's reluctance to expose themselves to any degree of risk, and how also as employers outside, but once we kind of get past an emergency response, which you can emergency to safeguard everybody, how do you continue safeguarding people whilst we're actually exposing into a little bit more risk now? It is a difficulty, and I think it's different for every single industry, isn't it?
Absolutely. Steph, did you want to add to that at all?
Oh, I really acknowledge the challenge. I think in some ways the first 8 weeks of lockdown will be the simpler days, and I don't mean to play that down, I really don't, so I don't mean to offend anybody, but at least with the first 8 weeks of lockdown we were told exactly what to do. So you need to stay in to stay safe, to protect yourself and to protect the NHS, and that's what people did. And I think this middle ground now of people needing to go back to work, suffering with FOGO, suffering with anxiety, with stress, whatever it is that's causing them a problem, is going to be really challenging. And I have just one thing to say, which is compassion. That is what is required to get us through. If we are employers, the way that we come to this needs to be with compassion. So compassion in terms of what do my people need, and how do I walk a mile in their shoes to understand what it is that they're going through, and how do I support them in that in a way where they can feel comfortable, confident, and have the courage to come to work. So 3 C's I've just done there unknowingly. But then I think that there's a second part, which is if I'm an employer, I need to come to this with compassion for what it is that the person that is employing me is also going through. So I honestly think it's compassion that will get us through. It's about this level of human understanding that we are all in it together. We can come to this with a sense of common humanity, and through compassion in a way where we try to understand each individual person's situation, because everybody will struggle and everybody will find it challenging. But it's just stopping, thinking, bringing our attention to that and working through it in a way where it is honest, we can understand one another, we can have open conversations, and we deal with it in a step-by-step way through compassion. And I know for some that might sound a little bit grey and a bit woolly, but I honestly think that's what it comes down to, is that we've got to put ourselves into somebody else's shoes, walk a mile in their shoes to know exactly what it feels like to be them, employer, employee. Look at it from a different angle, and then see what we can do together to go forward, because there will be levels of discomfort for so many people. Okay.
Thank you both. There's a couple more questions that have come in, and well, actually, one from Teresa, both from Teresa actually. She says she's offering some services through her company, which I'll get Neil and Molly to share after this webinar. But she's also said thank you very much for a great discussion, and it's her particular comment is great to know we can support ourselves as friends and agree compassion and humility is really key. And I think just everybody being on this webinar this morning is testament to the fact that we're all recognising that we can help each other. That's the starting point, isn't it? Nobody's got all of the answers. This is something that we've never had to face before, and let's hope we are all better prepared for the next one, because there will be a next one, I'm sure. And let's ask Molly and Neil if we can keep this particular channel of mental health and wellbeing going over the coming months, because I feel we've just touched the surface this morning. If everybody would like to think about other topics that they would like to discuss around mental health and wellbeing, at the end of the day, we're all business people, we're all parents, we're all carers, we're all members of society, so there must be lots of different areas that we could touch upon, and I'm sure we could come back again with something. So Molly, do we need to trail any other webinars that are coming up, or are we good for now? Molly going to reply? Look at my...
Yeah, I just got one more slide here, just telling everyone just about 2 webinars which are coming up next week.
Great. So you can all see that. Great. Very timely. So we've touched on this today, facilitating a smooth transition back to work. Obviously, it's from our friends at Thompson, Son and Passmore, so they are a law firm. So there'll be lots of practical information there. I would advise everybody listening to this one to log on definitely and have a look at that. I think that'd be really helpful, and perhaps support some of the conversations we've touched on today. And then MHA are back with Future of the Workplace. I'm sure we're going to be talking about tech and more tech. And yeah, they seem to be very relevant ones following on from today's session. So without further ado, I think that's it from me. We've run it to time. I think Molly has said again, any questions, any contacts, you've got her information there. She's very efficient. I can vouch for Molly. She's been superb help to me. So thank you very much publicly to Molly and Neil for supporting on these webinars. And most importantly, thank you to Stephanie and Duncan for the engaging content today. And thank you to everybody that's taken part. Okay. Have a good day, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.